Look at this crazy graph. The price per unit of electricity in the UK varies depending on how the electricity is generated. Generally speaking, the more gas is being burned, the higher the price. Today, for example, there's not much wind around, and so the price is relatively high, fluctuating at about £100 per megawatt hour. For reference, the average over the past 12 months is £71 per megawatt hour. But look at what happened last week. On Wednesday, the price climbed above £200, then £400. It seemed to stabilise at £600 before climbing again to over £1,000 and eventually peaking at just under £1,400 per megawatt hour at about 5 p.m. The worst price spike, almost 20 times the average price since the energy crisis started. What happened? Well, this was basically the worst case scenario for the UK grid. There was very little wind due to a weak weather system centred over the UK, which meant we missed out on our largest source of cheap electricity. And by UK standards, it was cold everywhere, which meant that heating, partly supplied by electric sources like heat pumps, was in high demand. The result was a shortfall between electricity demand and what the grid was supplying of almost 2 gigawatts. So the National Energy System Operator started an auction for electricity suppliers to quote their price to turn on extra gas-fired power plants. And the price of that auction got very high very quickly. In fact, 2 power station owners were paid more than £12 million for just 3 hours of electricity supply. Now, you might think that that high price should just be for that extra bit of electricity supplied to the grid, right? Like, it shouldn't set the price for everything. Unfortunately, no. I've done a whole previous video on how UK electricity pricing works and why it desperately needs reform. In fact, this might be the clearest signal we've ever had that the UK's electricity pricing scheme needs to be reformed. And we can expect an announcement about that in the coming months. I know that because I asked the Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero, Ed Miliband, myself. See my YouTube video about that experience. But it's also worth stressing that this was the worst case scenario for a UK grid dependent on wind, and clearly the UK grid wasn't up to the task. Adding more wind capacity, which is what we are currently doing, will help, but it doesn't address the underlying vulnerability. The UK needs more backups to wind generation. That means more storage, both batteries and pumped hydro, and better interconnections with other electric grids in Europe, and ideally also more low-carbon sources of electricity like geothermal and tidal and, dare I say it, nuclear. If we don't fix this many times in the future, I'll be saying